In the quiet moments before dawn on a remote island, a secret was born. It was a secret forged from desperation, grease, and a 6-inch piece of piano wire. What one man did in the dark, against every rule, would change how American fighters flew for the rest of the war. Stay with us, and you'll learn a story of quiet courage that official history almost forgot. It is 7:42 in the morning on August 17, 1943. The air at WWII Airfield in New Guinea is thick with the scent of aviation fuel and damp earth. Under the wing of a P-38 Lightning, a technical sergeant named James McKenna watches his pilot. The pilot is Lieutenant Robert Hayes, just 23 years old. He is preparing to fly a mission he probably won't survive. 18 Japanese fighters are on their way, and Hayes will be flying straight into them. McKenna knows this airplane better than he knows himself. For 8 months, he has lived and breathed the P-38. He knows the sound of its twin engines starting in the morning chill. He knows the feel of its metal skin, still warm from the tropical sun. It is a beast of an aircraft, fast, powerful, and a killer at high altitude. But it has a fatal secret, a problem that is killing American pilots every single day. It couldn't turn with the Japanese Zero. In the deadly dance of aerial combat, this was everything. The Zero was a master of agility. It was lighter, nimbler, and could execute a full turn in half the time of the heavier P-38. In a dogfight, that small difference was a death sentence. The official rulebook was clear. P-38 pilots should never ever try to outmaneuver a Zero. The doctrine was to use speed and altitude. Dive in, take a shot, and climb out. A hit and run, whatever you do, the instructors said. Don't get caught in a turning fight. But what good is a rulebook when the enemy refuses to play by it? The Japanese pilots were smart. They knew about the P-38's weakness. They would bait the American pilots, tempting them into a turn, knowing they could cut inside, get on their tail, and send them spiraling into the jungle below. The 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s in the last 6 weeks alone. 37 planes. 37 young men. Most of them were caught in the exact turning engagements they were told to avoid. McKenna had watched too many of them die. They were just kids, really. They would climb into their cockpits with brave faces and come back in boxes, or they wouldn't come back at all. The training manuals blamed pilot error. The official reports claimed the pilots weren't following orders, but McKenna, with his hands on the cold machinery every day, knew the truth. The problem wasn't the men, it was the machine. He had felt it with his own hands. Deep inside the twin booms of the aircraft, the control cables that moved the ailerons had a tiny bit of slack. Not much, maybe 3/8 of an inch. But in a high-speed turn, that tiny slack created a split-second delay, a lag, between when the pilot moved the stick and when the plane actually responded. It was a fatal hesitation. This brings us to a well-known fact of the Pacific Air War. The early P-38 Lightning models struggled against the more maneuverable A6M Zero in low-altitude dogfights. American pilots had to develop specific energy fighting tactics, like the boom and zoom, to leverage their plane's advantages in speed and altitude, avoiding turning fights at all costs. But here's a detail you might not know. Experienced mechanics like McKenna developed an almost intuitive sense for their machines. They could diagnose problems by sound and feel, things that engineering specifications on a page could never capture. McKenna could hear the difference in the sound the cables made when he tensioned them. A low twang, just slightly off-key, told him a cable was within spec, but still too loose for combat. His hands and ears knew a truth that the engineers, 7,000 miles away in California, did not. McKenna had tried to go through the proper channels. 2 months ago, he told his engineering officer about the slack. The officer dismissed him. The cable tension was within factory specifications, he said. To change it would void the aircraft's warranty. A field mechanic had no authorization to modify a flight control system. The conversation was over. And so, the pilots kept dying. How long can a good man follow orders when he knows those orders are leading others to their graves? The first pilot McKenna lost was Lieutenant David Chen, a young man from Sacramento who used to talk with McKenna about working on cars back home. Chen returned from a mission with 3 bullet holes stitched neatly into his left boom. He told McKenna the plane felt slow to respond, mushy, just as he tried to roll away from a Zero. His wingman saved him that day, but the plane's hesitation almost cost him his life. 3 weeks later, flying a different P-38, Chen was gone, caught in a turning fight. The plane didn't respond fast enough. This raises an unsettling question that history rarely asks. What if McKenna had been a commissioned officer instead of an enlisted sergeant? Would his concerns have been taken more seriously? It's impossible to know, but it forces us to wonder how many life-saving ideas have been lost because the person who had them didn't have the rank to be heard. The loss is mounted. Captain William Morrison, an experienced ace with 11 kills, died when his controls felt mushy during a dive. His crew chief, a friend of McKenna's, was convinced something was wrong with the plane. He checked the wreckage. Everything was within spec. The official report, once again, said pilot error. By the middle of August, McKenna had worked on the aircraft of 17 pilots who never came home. He had signed their maintenance logs. He had watched them taxi to the runway. The smell of the flight line, fuel, hot metal, and hydraulic fluid had become the smell of death. And McKenna knew why. That fraction of a second, that tiny bit of slack, a detail the rulebook said was acceptable, was in fact a killer. And as he watches Lieutenant Hayes prepare for his flight, McKenna knows that this young man will be next unless something changes, unless someone breaks the rules. The problem, as McKenna saw it, wasn't that the American pilots were afraid or unskilled. The problem was that combat didn't follow a script. Every briefing, every training flight, drilled the same lesson into their heads. Never turn with a Zero. But a dogfight is a chaotic, swirling world of instinct and reaction, where rules written on a chalkboard are the first casualty. A pilot doesn't always get to choose his fight. Sometimes the fight chooses him, and the fight had chosen Lieutenant Robert Hayes. He was a farm kid from Iowa, just 23 years old, and for 2 months in New Guinea he had done everything by the book. He'd flown 6 combat missions and had 0 kills to his name. Not because he was a bad pilot, but precisely because he followed the rules. And those rules were failing him, time and time again. On his 3rd mission, Hayes did everything perfectly. He dove on a Zero from high altitude, building his speed to 400 miles per hour. He came in from the sun, just like the manual said. He had the enemy plane in his gun sight, started to pull the trigger for a deflection shot, and in that instant, the Zero snap-rolled and dove away. Hayes tried to follow, but as he moved the stick, his P-38 felt like it was moving through mud. The response was sluggish, heavy. By the time the nose of his aircraft pointed where he wanted it to go, the Zero was nothing but a speck disappearing into the green jungle canopy below. He pulled out, climbed back to altitude, and returned to base without firing a meaningful shot. His 4th mission was worse. Hayes and his wingman ambushed 2 Zeros at 15,000 feet. He got a burst off, but it missed. The Zero reversed its turn, a hard, banking maneuver. As Hayes rolled to follow, his wingman's voice crackled over the radio. 2 more Zeros diving from above. Hayes knew he had to get out. He tried to roll back to level flight and dive away. to use his P-38's superior speed. The airplane responded, but slowly. Just slowly enough for one of the diving Zeros to stitch a line of 20mm cannon shells across his right engine boom. The shells didn't penetrate the armor, but the terrifying sound, like a hammer hitting an anvil right next to his head, scared him badly. He broke off the engagement, his engine smoking, and ran for home. He survived, but a piece of his confidence did not. He began to doubt the machine. He began to doubt the doctrine. Was he doing something wrong? Or was something wrong with the plane itself? This brings us to a mainstream historical fact about air combat. Pilot morale and trust in their equipment are decisive factors. A pilot who believes their aircraft has a fundamental flaw will fly more defensively, hesitate at critical moments, and ultimately be less effective in combat. This psychological element was as real and as dangerous as any enemy fighter. But here's a more obscure detail. The pilots themselves often came up with unofficial terms for these mechanical quirks. The P-38's slow roll rate at certain speeds was sometimes called the heavy wing. Pilots would warn each other about it, sharing tips on how to compensate. It was a known issue, but it was treated like a personality flaw of the aircraft, something you had to learn to live with. No one thought of it as a mechanical problem that could or should be fixed. Then came the fifth mission. On August 14th, Hayes watched his best friend die. His wingman was Lieutenant Thomas Parker, just 21, from Boston. They had come up through training together. Over the skies of Finschhafen, Parker got separated from the formation. 2 Zeros got on his tail. Hayes watched, helpless, as Parker tried everything he'd been taught. He rolled, he reversed. He tried to force an overshoot. But the Zeros stayed glued to him, anticipating his every move. Hayes heard Parker's voice on the radio, calling for help. He heard the rising panic, the desperation, and then he heard the words that would haunt him forever. "My airplane. It won't turn fast enough." Then, the sound of gunfire over the open mic. A scream, and then silence. What must it feel like to hear your friend's last moments broadcast over a radio, knowing you are powerless to help? How does a young man go on from that, climbing back into the same machine that failed his friend? Hayes didn't sleep that night. No one in the squadron did. The next morning, Parker's bed was empty. His personal belongings were quietly packed and shipped home. His P-38 was officially written off as a combat loss. The maintenance log, which McKenna himself had signed, noted no mechanical issues. The official cause of death was listed as pilot error during defensive maneuvering. Pilot error. The words were a bitter pill. Parker wasn't a bad pilot. He had been a great pilot. He had simply been flying a machine that couldn't do what he asked of it in the moment his life depended on it. And McKenna knew it. He had worked on Parker's aircraft the morning he died. The engine timing was perfect. The controls were aligned. The cable tension was within spec. The airplane was, by every official measure, fine. But Parker was dead anyway. It was this unbearable gap between what the regulations said and what was happening in the sky that haunted James McKenna. And it was this same gap that drove Lieutenant Hayes to desperation. On the evening of August 16th, 2 days after Parker's death, Hayes found McKenna in the maintenance hangar. The sergeant was working late, his hands covered in grease. Hayes, his face pale and his voice low, asked a question that broke every rule of military protocol. He asked if there was anything McKenna could do to make the airplane roll faster, anything at all. He said he didn't care if it was regulation or not. He just wanted a chance, a fighting chance. In that moment, McKenna saw it all. He saw the fear in the young pilot's eyes. He saw the desperation of a man who felt he was being sent to his own execution. He saw a kid who knew with absolute certainty that he was going to die if something didn't change. This leaves us with a profound, unresolved question. Where does a mechanic's duty truly lie? Is it to the regulations in a manual, or to the life of the pilot in the cockpit? For McKenna, the two had become mutually exclusive. To save the pilot, he would have to betray the rule book. He looked at the young lieutenant, a boy who should have been back in Iowa tending to a farm. And he made a decision. He told Hayes to come back in the morning. He'd see what he could do. As Lieutenant Hayes walked away, the weight of his promise settled on James McKenna's shoulders. He was alone in the vast, echoing maintenance hangar. Most of the crew had gone to sleep. After 11 at night, the only sounds were the distant drone of generators and the soft ping of insects hitting the overhead lights. The air, thick with tropical humidity, smelled of engine oil and stale sweat. A single man was about to commit an act of professional sabotage, or an act of salvation. The line between the two had never been so thin. He pulled the inspection panel off the left boom of Hayes's P-38. The metal was still warm, holding the memory of the day's sun. Inside, a complex web of wires and hydraulic lines ran through the aircraft's skeleton. McKenna reached in and grabbed the aileron control cable. He pulled, and he felt it. That tiny bit of give. A slack of maybe 3/8 of an inch before the cable grew taut. His hands were calloused and aching from a long day of turning wrenches, but his fingertips could feel that slack as if it were a canyon. It was wrong. He knew it in his bones. This is a good moment to touch on a key historical fact about wartime production. Manufacturers like Lockheed were building aircraft at an unprecedented rate. To meet the immense demand, they relied on standardized parts and assembly line techniques. This meant adhering to tolerances, acceptable ranges of variation in parts and assembly. The slack in the P-38's control cables was within the factory's specified tolerance. On paper, it was perfectly acceptable. But the engineers in California weren't fighting for their lives at 15,000 feet. And that leads to a quirky, lesser-known detail of military life: the art of scrounging. Front-line mechanics became masters of improvisation, using salvaged parts and unconventional materials to keep their machines running. McKenna's secret weapon wasn't a new piece of technology from a lab. It was a 6-inch piece of high-tensile piano wire he had pulled from the rudder trim system of a wrecked P-38 2 weeks earlier. The aircraft was destined for the scrap heap, but a good mechanic never lets a useful part go to waste. He had kept it in his tool bag, not knowing why. Now, in the quiet of the hangar, he knew. He sat on the concrete floor, the piece of wire in one hand and a pair of pliers in the other. He began to bend it into a Z shape. The wire was stiff, hardened steel designed to withstand incredible tension. It fought him. Twice, his greasy hand slipped. On the second try, the sharp end of the wire sliced into his thumb. Blood welled up, dark in the dim light, making the wire slippery. He cursed under his breath, wiped the blood on his coveralls, and kept working. It took him 8 minutes of focused, painful effort to get the bends just right. This small, crude Z-shape would act as an inline tensioner, adding just enough preload to the cable to eliminate that deadly slack. Now came the hard part, installing it. The space inside the boom was cramped, designed for wires and pulleys, not for a grown man's arm. McKenna had to contort his body, wedging his shoulder against a metal frame that dug into his flesh. He held a flashlight in one hand, trying to aim its unsteady beam, while working with the other. Shadows danced and jumped, playing tricks on his eyes. He fumbled with the tiny clevis pin that held the cable to a pulley. His numb fingers dropped it. He heard it bounce, a tiny metallic clink, before it vanished into the darkness of the boom. His heart pounded. 5 minutes passed as he felt around blindly, his fingers tracing every surface, searching for that crucial pin. The entire time a cold fear washed over him. If the engineering officer walked in right now, if anyone saw him doing this, it would be the end of his career. Unauthorized modification of a flight control system was one of the most serious offenses a mechanic could commit. It meant a court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, maybe even prison time. But then he thought of Hayes. He thought of Parker. He thought of the 17 others, and his resolve hardened. Finally, his fingers found the pin. With renewed determination, he inserted his homemade piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley. He reconnected the cable. The fit was so tight now that he had to use the pliers to force the clevis pin back through the hole. When it finally snapped into place, he knew he had done it. He reached in and pulled on the cable again. This time, there was no give, no slack. The control surface on the wing moved instantly. It was perfect. What was the real risk here? If McKenna's makeshift part failed in flight, if the wire snapped under the strain of a high G maneuver, the cable could go slack, leaving Hayes with no control over his left aileron. The plane would likely enter an uncontrollable roll and crash. McKenna would be responsible for the pilot's death. This raises a difficult and perhaps unanswerable question. Is it better to let a man die following the rules, or to risk killing him by breaking them for a chance at survival? He carefully replaced the inspection panel, wiped his tools clean, and washed the blood from his hands. He walked out of the hangar just after 1 in the morning. The tropical night was still and humid. In the distance, he heard the faint drone of aircraft engines, probably Japanese night raiders. The sound sent a jolt of anxiety through his stomach. He had just gambled a young man's life on a piece of scrap wire and his own intuition. McKenna went to his bunk, but he didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night and waiting for the dawn. He had done all he could. Now, all that was left was to watch Lieutenant Hayes take off and to pray that he had made the right choice. As the sun climbed higher, McKenna could do nothing more. He stood on the flight line, a small figure against the vast backdrop of the airfield, and watched as Hayes's P-38 lifted from the runway. He watched it join the formation of 16 other aircraft, their engines a receding roar. He watched them turn northwest, toward Japanese airspace until they were just specks disappearing into the immense blue canvas of the morning sky. And then, all he could do was wait. The engagement began at 14 minutes past 8, at 13,000 feet over the Huon Gulf. The morning sun was at their backs, a perfect setup for a diving attack known as the bounce. Hayes was flying in the number 3 position when his element leader called out the target. 9 Japanese Zeros below them. They rolled in. Hayes picked a zero at the back of the formation and pushed his plane into a dive. His speed built to 380 miles per hour. The enemy aircraft grew rapidly in his gun sight. He could see the painted red circle, the rising sun on the fuselage. He could see the dark shape of the pilot's head in the canopy. He pressed the trigger. This is a key fact of the P-38's design. Its guns were all clustered in the nose. Unlike other fighters with guns in the wings, the P-38's 4 50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon fired in a straight, concentrated stream. If you could get a plane in your sights, the damage was devastating. A few of Hayes's shots sparked off the Zero's wing, but it wasn't a fatal hit. The Japanese pilot did exactly what Hayes expected. He snap-rolled to the right and dove away. It was the same evasive maneuver that had saved the Zero on Hayes's third mission. Instinctively, Hayes rolled to follow. and that's when he felt it. The airplane responded as if it had read his mind. There was no delay, no mushiness, no feeling of fighting against a heavy, reluctant machine. The moment his hand moved the stick, the aircraft obeyed. It snapped into a 90-degree bank in what felt like half the normal time. He got his nose down, and to his astonishment, the Zero was still right there, perfectly framed in his gun sight. He fired again. A 3-second burst. The rounds tore up the Zero's fuselage, from the tail to the cockpit. The engine erupted in a ball of fire and oil. The enemy plane rolled over and fell from the sky, a plume of black smoke marking its final descent into the jungle. It was Hayes's first kill, but in the chaos of battle, there is no time for celebration. A fascinating and somewhat grim detail from pilot accounts is the feeling of detachment in these moments. Many described it as if they were watching a film. The cognitive shock of taking a human life was often delayed, overridden by the immediate and overwhelming need to survive the next 30 seconds. His wingman's voice crackled on the radio, a frantic warning. Zeros diving from above. Hayes looked up. 3 of them were coming down fast. They had seen him shoot down their comrade, and now they wanted revenge. His training screamed at him to run, to push the throttles forward and use the P-38's superior speed to climb away. But the Zeros were already too close. Running wasn't an option. He had to fight. He did something that defied every rule he'd ever been taught. Instead of running, he rolled hard left and pulled back on the stick, reversing his direction to face the attackers head-on. The P-38 snapped around with a ferocity he had never experienced. The lead Zero, expecting a slow, lumbering turn, was caught completely by surprise. The Japanese pilot was now in a terrible position, exposed and vulnerable. Hayes fired, and the Zero's wing simply folded. The plane tumbled out of the sky. 2 kills in less than a minute. The other 2 Zeros tried to engage him, using a classic scissor maneuver to force him to overshoot, but Hayes stayed with them. Every time they reversed direction, his P-38 was right there, instantly matching their turns. The invisible weights had been lifted from his airplane. It danced. For the first time, Hayes felt like he was the hunter, not the hunted. One of the Zeros made a mistake, turning too hard and losing too much speed. Hayes got inside his turn, so close he felt he could reach out and touch him. He fired. The Zero came apart in the air. 3 kills. The last Zero broke away and fled. Hayes let him go. He was low on ammunition and fuel. He climbed back to altitude, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs, and rejoined what was left of his flight. The journey home was quiet. He flew on autopilot, trying to process what had just happened. When he landed back at WWII, McKenna was there, waiting on the flight line, his face a mask of anxiety. Hayes shut down the engines, the sudden silence deafening. He climbed out of the cockpit, his hands shaking, his flight suit soaked with sweat. He walked straight to McKenna, bypassing the cheering ground crew. He didn't need to say much. 2 words confirmed everything. It worked. This incredible success forces us to ask a difficult question. The official doctrine was based on the aircraft's known limitations. By changing the aircraft, McKenna also changed the pilot. Did his unauthorized fix save Hayes's life by improving the machine, or by giving him the confidence to defy the very rules that were meant to keep him safe? Perhaps the answer is both. What Hayes and McKenna didn't realize was that their secret was already beginning to unravel. They weren't the only ones who had seen the P-38 dance. High above the dogfight, Captain Frank Mitchell, a flight leader from another group, had watched the entire engagement unfold. From his vantage point at 15,000 feet, he saw something that didn't make sense. He saw Hayes's P-38 maneuvering with an agility that was, frankly, impossible. It snapped through rolls and reversed turns with the speed of a much lighter fighter. Mitchell knew the pilots in his theater. He knew their skill levels. Hayes was a decent pilot, but what Mitchell had just witnessed was something beyond skill. Something was different about his airplane. After landing, Mitchell found Hayes in the debriefing room. Hayes was still riding the wave of adrenaline, his hands trembling as he filled out the combat report confirming his 3 kills. Mitchell asked him point blank, what was different today? Hayes, still trying to process it himself, said he didn't know. The airplane just felt better, faster to respond. When Mitchell pressed, asking if maintenance had done anything to his aircraft, Hayes gave him the one clue he needed. He told him to go talk to Technical Sergeant McKenna. 2 hours later, Captain Mitchell found McKenna in the maintenance area, his hands already deep in the engine of another P-38. Mitchell, an officer, and McKenna, an enlisted man, stood facing each other in the greasy, humid air of the hangar. Mitchell didn't waste time. "What did you do to Hayes's airplane?" he asked. There was a long, tense silence. McKenna looked at the captain, weighing the risk. He could lie, deny everything, or he could tell the truth. He told the truth. He explained the piano wire, the cable tension, the violation of a dozen regulations. When McKenna finished, Mitchell didn't threaten him with a court-martial. Instead, he asked if McKenna could do the same thing to his airplane. He said he had lost 4 pilots from his own flight in the last month, all of them trapped in turning fights. If this simple fix could give his men a fighting chance, then regulations could wait. This brings us to a well-known historical reality of warfare. Successful tactics and innovations often spread through informal, unofficial channels long before they are formally adopted. This grapevine effect, driven by trust between soldiers on the ground, has often been more effective than top-down orders. That evening, McKenna modified Mitchell's P-38. The next morning, Mitchell flew it. He came back from the mission raving about the change. He told his wingman the airplane rolled, like a fighter instead of a truck. His wingman, hearing this, immediately went to find McKenna. He wanted the modification too. And here's a fringe detail about this quiet rebellion. The mechanics developed a simple, unspoken system to avoid detection. Since the engineering officer's inspection specifically checked for cable tension, the crew chiefs would remove the small piano wire tensioners just before a scheduled inspection, and then reinstall them immediately after. The pilots knew, the mechanics knew, the officers who weren't supposed to know didn't. It was a conspiracy of survival. By the end of August, word had spread from pilot to pilot, from mechanic to mechanic. There were no official memos, no changes to the maintenance manuals. It was a revolution passed in whispers. A crew chief in another squadron would hear about it from a pilot who had transferred in. Skeptical at first, he'd try it on one plane. That plane's pilot would come back from a mission with his first kill after weeks of frustration. Soon, 4 more planes would have the fix. By early September, an estimated 40 P-38s in New Guinea had McKenna's secret modification, and the enemy noticed. In late August, Japanese flight reports began to mention a change in the American fighters. The P-38s seemed more aggressive, more nimble. Tactics that had been reliably successful for months were suddenly failing. One of Japan's top aces, Saburo Sakai, a man with 64 confirmed kills, had an encounter that left him deeply confused. On September 3rd, he engaged a P-38 over Wewak. He used his signature move, luring the American into a turn, then snapping back in the opposite direction to get on his tail. He knew the P-38's timing perfectly. Except this time, the P-38 reversed with him, matching his move instantly. The American got guns on him, and Sakai, the legendary ace, was forced to dive away to save his own life. This leads to a fascinating and unresolved question from a tactical perspective. How do you develop a counter-tactic against an enemy capability you don't even know exists? The Japanese pilots were fighting a ghost. They knew something had changed, but they couldn't see it. They examined wreckage from downed P-38s and found nothing. The engines were the same. The guns were the same. They couldn't find the small 6-inch piece of wire hidden in the boom. The psychological impact on the Japanese pilots was profound. Their greatest advantage, the Zero's superior maneuverability, was being neutralized. The P-38, once a predictable and somewhat clumsy opponent in a turn, had become dangerously unpredictable. The kill ratios began to shift dramatically. In July, 2 P-38s were lost for every Zero shot down. By September, the ratio had reversed. The P-38 was now winning. The hunter had become the hunted. And it was all because a sergeant in a dirty hangar decided that saving lives was more important than following the rules. But secrets, especially in the military, rarely last forever. A revolution whispered in hangars and cockpits will eventually find its way onto a report. In October of 1943, a maintenance inspector at WWII noticed something strange. The control cable tension readings on the P-38s were inconsistent. Some were at the low end of the official specification, while others were much tighter. He traced the discrepancies to the small, unauthorized pieces of piano wire. A report was written and sent up the chain of command. For 3 weeks, that report sat on desks while officers debated what to do. On the one hand, regulations had been flagrantly violated. On the other, the squadrons using the illegal modification had drastically better kill ratios. Their pilots were surviving. The evidence was undeniable. The question wasn't whether the fix worked. The question was whether to punish the mechanics who had saved lives without permission, or to quietly approve their solution after the fact. Finally, in November, the manufacturer itself got involved. Lockheed sent a team of engineers to New Guinea to evaluate the field modification. They tested it, they measured the stress loads, they ran flight tests. Their conclusion was a quiet but stunning vindication for Sergeant McKenna. The modification was not only safe, but highly effective. In fact, their report stated that a similar tensioning system should have been part of the P-38's original design. This brings us to a major historical fact. Following these field reports, Lockheed integrated a factory-installed tensioning system into the next major version of the aircraft, the P-38J, which entered production in late 1943. McKenna's simple, unauthorized fix became standard issue. And here is the quiet and perhaps bittersweet detail that history almost forgot. James McKenna never received any official credit. There was no commendation, no medal, not even a mention in a report. The official Lockheed documentation attributed the control system improvement to its own ongoing engineering analysis. McKenna's name and his courageous act of insubordination appeared nowhere. The institution had absorbed his innovation, and in the process erased the innovator. But the true legacy of that night in the hangar isn't found in an official report. It's found in the lives of the men who came home. Robert Hayes survived the war. He flew 63 combat missions and shot down 11 enemy aircraft. He returned to his family's farm in Iowa in 1945, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 4 children. For 37 years, he worked as a crop duster, flying low over the fields of corn and soybeans. But he never forgot. Every year, on August 17th, the anniversary of his miraculous 3-kill mission, he would pick up the phone and call James McKenna just to thank him for saving his life. Captain Frank Mitchell also survived. He became a squadron commander and shot down 16 aircraft. He stayed in the Air Force after the war, retiring as a colonel in 1963, and he became the keeper of the story. To every young maintenance officer he mentored, he told the tale of McKenna's modification, ensuring they understood that sometimes the most brilliant solutions come from the enlisted mechanics who have grease on their hands and a clear view of the problem. And what of the man himself? James McKenna stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946. He then returned to Long Beach, California, and went back to working on cars. He opened his own garage and spent the next 42 years of his life working on engines. He rarely spoke of the war. When people asked what he did, he would just say he was a mechanic. He fixed airplanes, that's all. Decades later, in 1991, a military historian stumbled upon references to the piano wire fix in old maintenance logs. He tracked McKenna down. By then, McKenna was 73 years old. He confirmed the story, but with a quiet humility, saying it wasn't anything special. It was just a job that needed doing. The historian, after analyzing the improved survival rates, estimated that McKenna's simple fix may have saved the lives of between 80 and 100 American pilots. McKenna said he never counted. He just remembered the faces of the pilots who came back. For him, that was enough. And this leaves us with a profound and ultimately unresolved question. How do we measure the true legacy of a single, quiet act of courage? We can estimate the number of pilots saved, but what about the children they went on to have? The communities they helped build? The peace they enjoyed for decades? The impact of a life saved ripples through generations in ways no historian can ever count. James McKenna passed away in 2006 at the age of 88. His obituary noted his service as an aircraft mechanic in World War II. It did not mention that he broke the rules to save a generation of pilots. His garage in Long Beach is still there under new ownership. But on a wall in the back office hangs a faded photograph of a young mechanic in coveralls, standing proudly next to a P-38 Lightning. This is where innovation truly comes from, not from committees or boardrooms, but from the quiet, brilliant defiance of ordinary people who see a problem and simply refuse to let it stand. The story of James McKenna and his piece of piano wire is more than just a forgotten footnote of the Second World War. It is a timeless lesson about where real change comes from. It reminds us that progress is not always born in a sterile laboratory or a high-level meeting. Often, it is born in the mud, the grease, and the desperate moments on the front lines, where the consequences of a flawed design are not measured in dollars, but in lives. It reminds us that there is a profound wisdom in hands-on experience. The engineers who designed the P-38 were brilliant, but they could not feel the subtle slack in a control cable from 7,000 miles away. McKenna could. He possessed a different kind of knowledge, a tactile, intuitive understanding that came from living with the machine, day in and day out. His story is a tribute to all the mechanics, technicians, and sergeants whose vital contributions are so often overlooked by history, which tends to focus on generals and aces. And finally, this story asks us to think about the nature of true courage. There is the courage of the pilot, flying into enemy fire. But there is also the quiet, moral courage of the mechanic, who risks his career and his freedom not for glory or recognition, but simply because it is the right thing to do. He saw a problem, and he fixed it. In that simple act, he affirmed that the life of one young pilot was more important than any rule in a book. He chose humanity over bureaucracy, and because of that choice, dozens of families were kept whole, and 100 futures were made possible. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. If this story left you thinking, we hope you'll join us again for more journeys into the past. Until next time, stay curious and be kind to yourself.